Hey guys, today we're going to learn about active transport. Let's go. Remember from yesterday that the job of the cell membrane is to facilitate the movement of molecules across the membrane to allow certain things to enter and certain things to exit. There are two ways that your cell can use the cell membrane to regulate the movement of molecules. And the first way is called active transport. When you are active, say in gym class, you're expelling and you're using energy. Same thing applies here with active transport. Active transport is when the cell membrane requires the use of energy to move a molecule from one side to the other, either into the cell or out of the cell. When does a cell use active transport? A cell uses active transport when it's moving a molecule against the concentration gradient. The concentration gradient is defined as an uneven distribution or uneven concentration of molecules on two sides of the membrane. If you look at the picture on the left-hand side of our screen, you will notice that there is a cell membrane running down the middle. If you count up the number of little boxes on the left-hand side, there's 2. If you count up the number of boxes on the right-hand side, there's like 12. Because there's an uneven number, we have a concentration gradient formed. Active transport moves against the concentration gradient. Typically, your cells want to move things from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. But in this case, we're going against that flow. So we are moving from a lower concentration, the left-hand side, to a higher concentration on the right-hand side. We also use active transport if we're trying to move large quantities of molecules all at once. Say instead of letting a couple things trickle in at a time and we want to move a huge amount of them, like all 12 of those molecules, then we're going to use a little bit of energy to move those molecules into or out of the cell. The last example of when your cell is going to use active transport is when it's trying to move a really big molecule across the membrane, like a really big molecule. When you think active transport, I want you to think low to high, hence the L to the dash and the H, low to high. And I also want you to think about a slide on a playground. Normally, we want to move from the top of the slide to the bottom. We want to slide down it, right? Well, in that scenario, you wouldn't use energy. But in this scenario, we are, instead of sliding down the slide, we are going to climb up the slide. You are going from a lower height to a higher height, right? Low to high. And what do you have to do in order to climb up the slide? You have to use energy. The same thing happens here. It's also like trying to swim upstream, swimming against the current, or walking the opposite direction of your classmates down the hall. You are going against the flow, against the concentration gradient, so you have to use energy. The energy that our cells use in active transport is a chemical energy. It is known as adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. You may recall seeing the term ATP at some point. It's abbreviating for adenosine, A, tri, T, phosphate, P, ATP. And it is produced in the mitochondria during cellular respiration. Every time you breathe, every time you inhale, your cells are using that oxygen in order to produce chemical energy that we can then in turn use to move things against the concentration gradient. There are three different examples of active transport used by our cells. The first is called movement by a carrier protein or a pump. A carrier protein, also known as a pump, is a special type of transport protein that exists in the cell membrane. They're scattered throughout the cell membrane. We learned about them as a transport protein yesterday when identifying the parts of the cell membrane. A carrier protein is going to move something like vitamins or sodium or potassium. You need to highlight or underline that because those are very important to associate with a carrier protein or a pump. These are molecules that have an electrical charge or they do not mix with the cell membrane and therefore the cell membrane doesn't allow it to pass, but they need to get into or out of the cell. So our cell membranes include a pump or a carrier protein to facilitate the movement of those molecules. Now, when molecules move across the cell membrane through carrier proteins, they will move from a lower concentration to a higher concentration. The GIF on the right-hand side shows that the green molecules are moving in one direction and the yellow molecules are moving in the other direction. Again, if you were to count them up, there would be a lower concentration on the side they're coming from and a higher concentration on the other side. Because we're trying to push them and pull them across the cell membrane, our protein changes shape because it's pushing and or pulling, and it's using energy to do so. The second form of active transport is called endocytosis. When you see endo or EN, you need to think of the term in or into. This is the movement of molecules using active transport into the cell through the formation of a vesicle, a small pocket. Look at the GIF on the right. Those molecules are entering the cell by the cell membrane producing a small little divot, and then that divot will close off and form a vesicle, the small pocket. When the cell membrane uses endocytosis to move molecules into the cell that are really big quantities of molecules, it doesn't want to allow a little bit to move at a time, but a huge amount. The process is called pinocytosis. Pino meaning large quantity of molecules. This would be an example used by root cells to absorb water from the ground. They take big gulps, if you will, chug the water by allowing the water to come in these large vesicles. A cell can move one large molecule also into the cell using endocytosis. This process is called phagocytosis. PH sounds like the letter F. Phagocytosis is used by your white blood cells to engulf and destroy viruses and other pathogens. It's also used by the amoeba. The amoeba stretches out its pseudopods surrounding its prey and forming a vesicle that will allow it to be transported inside and then digested as food. The last type of active transport is called exocytosis. And when you think exocytosis, you need to underline the EX and you need to think exit. Exocytosis for exit. This is when your cell membrane uses a vesicle to release and remove large quantities of molecules from inside to the environment. This is basically the opposite of exocytosis, and it's one of the ways that our cells gets rid of waste and proteins. When our cells make a whole lot of waste, we store it in our vacuoles, and when it gets digested by the lysosomes, it will then take the trash, send it out through a vesicle. It will absorb and fuse with the cell membrane and release the trash out into the environment, which in this case would be your blood, and your blood would circulate the trash until it's removed from your blood and you go to the bathroom. This also happens with proteins. Remember, we use proteins to communicate with other parts of our bodies, such as we produce lots of hormones that are used for communication. Our body will produce those hormones. It'll package them or store them in a vesicle, and then when we need to send out messages, we take that vesicle, bring it to the cell membrane, allow it to fuse, and throw out the message into the rest of the body. Here's an example of endocytosis and exocytosis. If you look, there are molecules on the outside in that greenish environment that then approach the cell membrane. It forms an indent that will close off and pinch off and form a vesicle, and then that vesicle will enter the cell and go wherever it needs to go into the cell. Likewise, if we were looking at exocytosis, trash or proteins that are being produced, those molecules will approach the cell membrane, that vesicle will fuse with the cell membrane, and then release the trash or the hormones into the extracellular environment. We'll watch it a couple more times just to let you see really what's going on here with the vesicles entering and exiting. Now that we've completed our notes on active transport, I want to give you a little bit of time to complete your check yourself questions and assess your understanding of active transport. You've had a little bit of time to check yourself. Let's review these answers. Okay, number 1, active transport moves molecules from a blank to blank concentration. Hopefully, you wrote from a low concentration to a high concentration, or you could have done L, arrow, H. Perfect. Number 2, what type of energy is used during active transport? You could have put one of two answers. You could have put ATP, or you could have written the whole thing out, which is pronounced adenosine triphosphate. Both are acceptable. And number 3, what is another name for a carrier protein? Pump. It's a pump. Like when you pump your fist in the air, you're changing shape, just like a carrier protein changes shape to allow the movement of molecules into or out of the cell.